As the start of April-May rolled around, the peninsula was still in the final throes of winter, and thus still relying on blackthorn to provide them with wood to burn. Thankfully, what they lacked in wood, they'd managed to gain in clay, with their stockpiles now sporting more than enough clay bricks to begin expanding the walkways throughout the town. Helping the group to move around town faster would be especially important to poor Oywoon, who, during her brave stand against the goblin hordes, had lost her one good leg and one of her arms. Not only would she be slower getting around town, but her ability to build would be sorely impacted by the loss of the arm, to say nothing of her ability to stand as the town's bulwark against encroaching enemies. As the sun begins to fall, a group of goldy oxen enter the peninsula. These massive golden beasts are quite a rare sight, but are revered for the quality of both their milk and their wool. Of course, any attempts to tame them could result in a swift kick to the head for the poor creature who tries it. So in the interest of keeping their brains inside their skulls, the group decide to leave them be and let them wander the peninsula freely. Besides, the collective already have plenty of work on their hands maintaining their current menagerie. Saddened to see the sorry state that his old friend Oywoon finds herself in, Gunther suggests to Blackthorn that they perform another ritual, using more of the grass that surrounds the anima tree, hoping that this will in turn further boost his powers. The process appears to be a success, and Gunther feels a swell of new power within him. That night he visits Oywoon and attempts to channel his powers into regrowing her lost limbs. Gunther is excited when he feels the power leaving him, but is concerned by the lack of a new arm or leg on Oywoon. Over the course of that morning though, as Oywoon lies stunned in her bed, a new leg begins to form where her old one used to be. The toes begin to grow first, with the rest of the leg hopefully following soon after. It's clearly going to be a more painful and horrifying process than Gunther had expected, but it has technically worked. Or at least it seems to be thus far. This is all a little out of the realms of his usual medical work, but he decides to carry Oywoon to the hospital to keep an eye on her in a more medical setting, just in case he needs to step in to try and do something. One thing is clear, however, even if the leg does fully grow back, the process will be long and painful, keeping Oywoon away from her tasks for quite a number of days. And there was still an arm and another leg to go after this. With the stockpiles of fecal sludge becoming a little bit too much, Jayla suggested burning it, to take a bit of a more active approach to disposing of the stuff. So in the end they set up a little pit on the eastern side of the peninsula, which, given the sheer volume of feces that they'd accumulated so far, would likely be burning non-stop for quite some time to come. This did shine a light on another issue for the town, namely that they were still all expelling waste in the same dingy little latrines that they'd built when they first arrived. With the whole town having come on leaps and bounds since then, Magnala suggested that they put some effort into at least expanding their toilets a little, to make them a little bit less horrible. A full 24 hours after Gunther's spell began to take action, Oywoon was conscious enough to crawl her way out of the hospital and back to the comfort of her own house. Although it was likely to still be a good few days before the leg was fully regrown and functional. With the collective now managing to store as much food as they were, some of it was lying in storage so long that it was going bad. This was a good sign, even if it was a bad outcome. It was nice that their food situation was now so secure that they literally couldn't eat it all fast enough, but it was a shame for so much of it to simply go to waste. To remedy this, Prentice suggested utilising the cold temperatures of their long winters to essentially turn the storeroom into a freezer during the winter months. To do this, the group would simply carve a second entrance through the hill and into the storeroom, which would be left open to allow the frigid winter air to freeze the food, whilst allowing the kitchen to maintain some semblance of heat, just so that it wasn't a nightmare for the chef to have to cook the group's meals. Just as the group were finishing up this new design, the Goldie Oxen decided that, even though nobody had tried to tame them, they were going to make themselves a problem regardless, and they began hunting down the collective. Hoping to bring them down before they could hurt anyone, the collective all joined together, and tried to find a place where they could use the range of their bows to their advantage. Given her weakened state and her lack of a ranged weapon, Gunther ordered the painfully slow Oywoon to take refuge in one of the buildings until the danger had passed. Having forgotten his bow that morning meant that Gunther had volunteered to be the bulwark, regardless of his feelings on the matter. Thankfully the group were able to launch enough arrows to bring down the hardy beast before it could do any real damage to Gunther. After the death of the first, the other two Goldie oxen seemed to think better of the attack and began trying to run. But, not wanting to give them a chance to sneak up on them during the night, the collective gave chase, and were able to ensure that none of the Goldie oxen would ever be an issue for them again. After a short, but we assume passionate, night, Gunther and Jayla realised that she'd fallen pregnant, meaning that a second family line was beginning within the Phyrexian collective. With his propensity to see signs from the gods in even everyday occurrences, Gunther couldn't help but feel a little bit apprehensive at the fact that their pregnancy announcement was followed almost immediately by the sun being blotted out by huge plumes of ash from an erupting volcano. Bad omens aside, this could mean that they entirely missed their growing season this year, meaning they'd have to survive almost another whole year on the meagre supplies they still had at the end of an already long winter. With Oywoon's leg becoming more leg-like every day, she was soon back to work, helping to lay down the new paths in the town. Since there seemed to be little point in planting new crops with the volcanic winter still in effect, Blackthorn decided to try her hand at helping Magnala with mining out the new toilets. It was nice to see the group trying new things when faced with these issues. She did, however, immediately decide that mining was not for her, and despite the hopelessness of trying to grow anything, she returned to the fields to sow some potatoes, just to test if they could survive in the incredibly low levels of sunlight that were making it through the ash clouds. The next morning, with Oywoon's new leg fully grown, she was determined to get the process over and done with for her arm too. Given that the lack of an arm was slowing down her work so much anyway, Gunther had no arguments against her being out of the action for another couple of days, so he used his magic once more to begin the process of regrowing the arm. Despite the cloying clouds of ash hanging in the sky, the temperatures outside weren't quite as low as they had been during winter, and there was just enough sunlight getting through to allow for the growth of crops, albeit at a much slower rate than normal. It seems as though this news angered Prentice. Perhaps she'd been looking forward to a year without working in the fields, and in response, she decided to start setting the fields on fire. Nature immediately fought back against her destruction, in the form of a very angry little squirrel, which attempted to stop her fire-starting ways. Despite his anger at Prentice's actions, Louisa was still kind enough to stop and shoot the squirrel off of her first, whilst he was on his way to extinguish the fires that she had started. A group of traders from the Northern Realm arrived, and the collective used this as an opportunity to sell off some of their young horses and hides in order to purchase some straw and some components. Jayla had recently figured out how to create steel for themselves, so the collective were on course to becoming more technologically advanced, which the components would help with. Using the straw, along with some of the new steel they could now make, the group threw together a couple of training dummies for both melee and ranged training, which would provide a nice bit of recreation for the collective, whilst also allowing them to hone their skills. The remnants of some past battle had been strewn across the eastern side of the peninsula ever since they arrived, but Gunther had always found it incredibly unsightly, and finally got around to asking Magnala to dismantle as much of the wreckage as she could. She found she had a real taste for smashing the old devices to pieces, and ended up smashing them until the sun rose the next morning. Magnala had clearly found her calling. She'd even managed to liberate quite a bit of usable wood during her endeavours. Speaking of finding their calling, Prentice seemed to be really into starting fires these days, this time choosing the much more dangerous and problematic location of the town's stockroom to be setting things alight. Thankfully, the group responded quickly and the damage was minimal, but they'd need to keep a closer eye on Prentice going forward. The new toilet was coming along nicely, and in the interest of keeping the perch clean and beautiful, they decided to build a septic tank to expel their waste into, instead of just piping it directly into the sea and polluting the area. The group didn't quite have a way to draw up enough water to make the sewage system fully functional, but that could be a fun little research task for Jayla to work on in the background. After a long few years, the group finally saw their first harvest of lumber come in from the eastern thicket, which was a wonderful occasion. With the lack of sunlight due to the volcanic winter, the trees were currently growing at a snail's pace, so it was likely to be an extra few days before the others were ready for harvesting. But it was still nice to see the culmination of plans which had been years in the making. One day, Magnala made the mistake of insulting Gunther's clothing. which, given that he was the tailor for the whole town, sent him into a fit of rage and they began fighting. It was a brutal fight, which culminated in Gunther sinking his teeth into Magnala's shoulder. Naturally, this wound became infected, meaning that Magnala would need to spend a few days in the hospital, where she would be tended to by the very man that had bitten her. One thing was for sure though, she'd never dream of insulting Gunther's clothes ever again. Another guild merchant arrived at the peninsula, this one specialising in weaponry. Feeling a tiny bit guilty for having bitten Magnala, Gunther asked Jayla to purchase a fancy new weapon to give her as a gift. The merchant had a runic longsword, which would be extremely dangerous in Magnala's hands, so Jayla traded a lot of the equipment they had stored, along with some other random bits and bobs in order to be able to afford the sword. With unfortunate timing, a slave ship soon arrived from the guild too, and amongst their stock was a young dwarf named Coalpillar. Unfortunately, the ruined sword had cost an arm and a leg, so in an effort to both liberate Coalpillar and also expand the diversity amongst the old races of the collective, the group ended up selling all of the books they'd accumulated in order to afford the purchase. Having grown up a slave, this life would be very new to Coalpillar, so they temporarily placed him in the prison, until the group could properly instill in him how things worked around the collective. With the anima grass blooming once more, Oywoon suggested that Magnala undergo the linking ritual to try and awaken any latent magic in her. Oywoon made the case that Magnala was an excellent melee combatant, and with the help of magic, she might become even greater, helping to defend the town against any attackers a lot more effectively. What Oywoon didn't mention was that she was sick of being injured by being thrown into the melee, and was hoping that if Magnala developed magic abilities, she would be the first into the fray instead. Gunther agreed with Oywoon's publicly stated logic, however, and the group gathered to perform the linking ceremony for Magnala. In fact, with the abundance of anima grass that they had, they managed to complete the ceremony not once, not twice, but 3 times in rapid succession, to give Magnala a massive boost to her magical potential. Sure enough, her powers seemed to lean towards improving her martial skills, allowing her to move at greater speeds for a short time, leap large distances to get close to enemies, and even heighten her reflexes and strengthen her muscles to improve her abilities in combat for a short time. During the time they'd spent on the linking ceremonies, the Human Empire had sent another royal tribute collector to the peninsula, looking to intimidate the collective into bending the knee to the Human Emperor. No longer willing to endure the disrespect, Gunther readied his people at the defences, and took Louisa and Prentice outside the walls, to show the Empire what he thought of their demands. The collective had anticipated the humans attacking them, but after their arrows felled one of them, the rest of them simply fled, vowing vengeance against the collective. And so it was that all-out war was declared between the collective and the Human Empire. The worst of the ash from the volcano had finally settled, giving the fields a helpful little burst of sunlight to speed up their growth. And, despite their initial concerns, the fields were blooming, and it looked like they might just be able to get a harvest in before the winter temperatures dropped once more. Late that night, Jayla went into labour. She decided to follow in Prentice's footsteps, and dropped the child out on her way to the hospital, expelling it right out onto the bridge in the centre of town. And thus, the collective welcomed Jayla and Gunther's son to the town. With steel now available to them, Louisa suggested putting some of it towards armour for their melee fighters, to maybe avoid Oywoon losing any more limbs. The group agreed, Magnala and Oywoon most enthusiastically out of the bunch, and the group got to work making 2 full sets of protective armour for the pair. Alongside the harvest of the potatoes and the peas, the eastern thicket was also fully felled, allowing the group to replenish their stocks once more, saving them for a long, cold, hungry winter. With the animal herd constantly growing, and the group only having limited opportunities to sell them off, Magnala worked with Louisa to extend the barn to allow them to keep more of the beasts for longer. It was just as well that the potatoes and peas had been harvested, as, not long after, the temperatures were already dropping so low that they would prevent growth. In fact, this led to the agricultural group having to harvest the flax and the hay early, in order to make sure it didn't all die out before they got it out the ground. Feeling as though they'd finally broken some of Coalpillar's conditioning, the group felt confident in releasing him out into the town to become part of the collective. With his skill set, and the lack of construction and mining skills the rest of the group had, he would be a valuable addition to the community. No sooner had Coalpillar joined, however, than he found himself wishing for the safety of the prison cell, as a human raiding force appeared on the peninsula. Coalpillar was directed to the smithy to equip himself for the fight, while the whole town, including young Samony, made for the defences to protect the town. Realising that the attackers were taking time to plan, Guthor, Jayla and Louisa ventured out to try and goad them into attacking before they came up with a plan, by sending arrows towards them. Unfortunately, the attackers had ranged weapons of their own, and Guthor soon took a crossbow bolt. Just at that moment, a group of traders from the Northern Realms arrived on foot at the peninsula. There was no love lost between the raiders and the Northern Realms, and the two groups soon broke into an all-out fight, with Guthor and the squad trying their best to help out their allies from the Northern Realms. Unfortunately, even with the help of the elves, the caravan guards were no match for the fighting force of the attackers, and the traders were soon overcome, with the elves being forced back behind the walls. Although the Northern Realms caravan had ultimately fallen, they had done a lot to help weaken the attacking group, meaning that the attack had lost a lot of its momentum. Magnala took up her new position as the bulwark at the defences, utilising her new powers alongside her new sword to tear through any of the attackers that got close enough. Although she tried, Oywoon couldn't even get close enough to engage any enemies before Magnala killed them. Oywoon was secretly overjoyed that her plan had succeeded. Magnala was enjoying herself so much that despite the attackers sounding their retreat, she leapt across the pond at the defences to tear down one last attacker. Only Guthor and Magnala had taken any damage, but hopefully spending some time side by side in the hospital together would help them patch up their differences. With Prentice and Louisa's second child finally growing old enough to wander the town on her own, they decided it was time to finally bless her with a name, and they went with Naoto. Early one September morning, the group were awoken in the night by a call to arms. The Divine Order had arrived once more and were charging directly at the defences. Bleary-eyed but determined, the collective made their way to the defences. They were, however, lacking their melee murder machine Magnala, who was currently having a bit of a mental breakdown. The surprise attack meant that the Divine Order reached the defences before most of the collective, immediately putting them at a disadvantage. The collective were able to do a bit of early damage, but the Order had brought a lot of people, and they couldn't bring them all down before they reached the defences. Despite her best efforts, it looked like Oywoon was going to have to act as the bulwark once more. As the battle wore on, things were beginning to look quite dire, with the archers having to shoot at attackers who'd already circumvented the defences, and Oywoon's attempts to reposition to protect them actually allowing more attackers in through the side. In a desperate attempt to help, Blackthorn gathered up as much mana as she could, and tried to let out a call to the animals in the region, requesting their help. Just before she could release the spell, however, one of the attackers sent a crossbow bolt right through her, causing her to hit the ground and interrupting the spell. Despite all of this, the defenders had been letting loose a constant stream of arrows, which had caused a lot of carnage in the ranks of the attackers, causing the first group to flee. As the second group of attackers approached the defenders, they pulled back, hoping that the heavy armour of the attackers would slow them down and allow the defenders to get distance on them to be able to continue firing. Unfortunately, the attackers appeared to be able to keep up, forcing the defenders into close quarters engagements. Just as everything was starting to seem incredibly dire, the Divine Order sounded the retreat. Despite the defenders thinking that their destruction was assured, it seemed that seeing so many of their comrades dead and bleeding out had taken its toll on the attackers, and they'd broken first, attempting to flee through the town. It was, however, a Pyrrhic victory, with Guthor, Louisa, Oywoon and Blackthorn all on the ground, and a number of the other defenders sporting an assortment of lesser injuries. While some of the collective dragged the injured to the hospital, Jayla and Prentice tried to chase down the fleeing Divine Order members through the town. They annoyingly broke down the main gate to escape, but Jayla made them pay for their actions. Prentice, Guthor and Louisa were all suffering from pretty extreme blood loss, but thanks to the combined efforts of Jayla, young Samini and their new friend Coalpillar, the group were able to stabilise everyone and avoid any fatalities. Of course, a few infections did crop up, but once Guthor was back on his feet the next day, he was able to handle those without too much difficulty. Things would likely be on a bit of a go-slow around the town for the next few days whilst everyone tended their wounds and took the time needed to heal. They found the time to drag the corpses out to sea, to save themselves the disgust of seeing them strewn across the ground. Unfortunately, those corpses are soon to be replaced with new ones. Whilst most of the collective are still nursing their wounds, a second raid arrives, this time from one of the human countries. The collective would just have to pray it wasn't their corpses floating out to sea next. With everyone in such a sorry state, Blackthorn knew that things were already desperate, so she immediately began casting her spell to call as many animals to their aid as she could. The efforts of the spell would put her in a short-term coma, taking her out of action for most of the fight, but she was hoping that the animals that she called to their defence would be more effective than her. With the injured state of the defenders, they struggled to stop the attackers from reaching the defences. Thankfully, these attackers were a lot lighter armoured than the Divine Order had been, allowing the elves to do some serious damage as they approached. Once they began to reach the elves' lines, they began a tactical retreat, trying to put enough distance between them and the attackers to launch more arrows, before then retreating further. This hit and run tactic worked like a charm, and despite their initially dire appraisal of the situation, they were able to send the attackers running once more. Although, once more, they chose to flee via the main gate by smashing it down, which was becoming a real nuisance for the collective to have to keep replacing it. The collective exacted a toll on the attackers as they ran, but unfortunately they had to break off the chase in order to tend to a large fire that had broken out in the hospital after one of the attackers had gotten themselves locked inside, and didn't seem to realise the issues of setting fire to a room that you can't escape. Sadly, it seemed that the animals Blackthorn had summoned had been too slow to do much, but the group were mostly just amazed that they'd be able to come through a second raid with so little damage after how much of a disaster the first one had been. In the following days, life in the town crept along at a slow pace, with the group slowly recovering and repairing the damage to the town. In all of the chaos, the gods had clearly seen fit to punish Oywoon for her underhanded attempts to pass off her responsibilities as the town's bulwark onto Magnala, and in response had taken another arm, another leg, a kidney and a thumb from her. Despite her best efforts, it looked like she was in for a lot more pain from the process of regrowing limbs in the near future. Louisa suggested that since the trenches outside the defences were doing a good job of slowing the attackers, they should dig some more on the beach directly in front of the defences. He figured that if attackers were slowed whilst in the range of the archers, they could dish out a lot of damage before attackers even got close. In the interests of improving everyone's moods following the attacks, Guthor suggests that they host a binge party, where the whole town can eat, smoke and drink as much as they like. The idea is a resounding success, with the whole town gathering together to party the night away. Sadly, poor Oywoon fell catatonic mere moments before the party started. But in the interest of making sure that she was still involved, they decided to host the party in the hospital, to ensure that she wasn't missing out. Kind of, anyway. As they partied, the first snows of winter had begun to fall. But in his happy state, Sammy got straight to work on clearing the paths once more. With Oywoon still catatonic, Guthor took the opportunity to utilise his magic to begin the limb regrowing process, hoping that she wouldn't feel the pain in her current state. It wasn't long before the collective's old friends the trolls resurfaced, this time burrowing up from the ground in the north of the peninsula. Viewing their proximity to the anima tree as a slight against the gods, Guthor rallied the troops to put a swift end to the creatures. Guthor's plan to start Oywoon's limb regeneration while she was catatonic to avoid her feeling the pain may have backfired, as it appeared that the pain had actually shocked her out of her catatonic state. As the winter snows fall once more, the first shipment of wood from Apple's new settlement arrives at the peninsula, just what they need to keep them warm in this new snow. Apple also reveals that, despite her best efforts, she has been struggling to come up with a name for the new settlement. So Guthor writes back his suggestion to name the settlement Tawar, after the elf god of the forest. It's possible that Guthor has a bit of a one-track mind when it comes to these things. It seems that yet more trolls have appeared on the peninsula, but this group seem content to treat the pile of corpses in the sea as their personal buffet, so the group are hopeful that as long as the corpse pile is full, the trolls won't see any need to target the collective. Unfortunately, the trolls instantly throw this kindness back in the collective's faces, as they begin to hunt down the very slow Oywoon, who's out working on the defences. Thankfully, Blackthorn and a mounted coal pillar are able to charge to the rescue, helping Oywoon fight off the troll with ease. Trolls weren't the only thing looking to take a bite out of the collective, however, as another group of human raiders approach the town. Blackthorn wastes no time, and immediately calls out for help from the nearby animals. The wild animals arrive, and together with the help of some of the trolls in the south, they manage to take out one of the groups of attackers. This well-timed intervention left only a meagre handful of the humans for the defenders to deal with. One of the attackers tried to show off their own magic by leaping across the defensive wall to get close to Prentice. But they didn't account for Magnala using similar magic to jump straight in and intercept the attacker, cutting them down in a single strike. The morning following the attack, Oywoon and Coalpillar finished up digging the new trenches in the midst of the defences, after which they moved on to hollowing out yet more of the mountain in order to give themselves even more storage space. As Oywoon was digging, Guthor thought he'd play a fun little prank where he sneaks up on her and blasts her with his limb regrowing magic, sending Oywoon to the ground writhing in pain as her left arm begins to sprout, partially formed from the side of her torso. Guthor has a bit of a weird sense of humour. That evening, the group were surprised to find yet more travellers from the Dwarven city-states. Given that the Dwarven cities had mostly just hidden in their mountains and offered no help to the old races during the expansion of the human empires, Guthor had no love for the governments of the city-states. He believed though that he could convince these individuals of the importance of what they were doing here. So, despite knowing that it would anger the governments of the city-states, he sent a mounted Magnala to apprehend the visitors and bring them to town where they could be convinced to join the collective. The visitors weren't overly thrilled by the concept of incarceration, however, and tried to fight back. Of course, with Magnala's skill, she was able to quickly down her attacker and give chase to the other. Alas, the second dwarf was able to escape from her, but she scooped up the injured dwarf named Etis and placed him in the town's prison. After a brief respite for a few days, the trolls decided they wanted to be an issue again, and yet more of them appeared on the peninsula. This time, however, they made the mistake of trying to take on a pack of direboar who were only too happy to put up a fight. The collective had high hopes that the two groups would take care of each other, but unfortunately they seemed to grow bored of fighting each other and soon fell asleep. Unwilling to wait until the trolls decided to attack them, a few archers from the collective ventured out to deal with the issue head-on the next morning. Due to the sheer number of trolls, things did get a little dicey, with the group having to pull far back into the defences. But in the end, they were able to defeat the trolls without casualties, but it was certainly close. Something was clearly wrong with Magnala, although no one was quite sure what it was, but she was suffering from a series of mental breakdowns, which culminated in her going berserk. Utilising her superior melee skills and her disgustingly sharp sword, she sent Blackthorn to the ground, before starting to attack the group's treasured pet axolotl Cristobal. She then moved on to attack a sleeping Guthor, who initially tried to flee, but upon seeing the injured Cristobal, his fury took over, and he began swinging back at Magnala. His wife Jayla, also woken in the night, joined the fray. Together they were able to beat Magnala into submission and rushed to Cristobal's aid. And once time permitted, they also helped Blackthorn. That night, the group were surprised to find one of their yak had simply keeled over, seemingly from malnutrition. They had thought they'd stockpiled an abundance of hay and flax, but it seemed as though they'd been asleep at the wheel. The population of the animals in the herd had grown far too large, and they'd already eaten their way through the entire stockpile of food. The solution would need to be twofold. First off, they would need to cull off a number of the foals and stallions that had been born, just to control the numbers. Secondly, they would need to move a new temporary food source into the animal pen. They chose to drag over a bunch of the nutrifungus they had, as they knew they could continue to grow even during the winter. It seems that letting that second dwarf escape had been a bigger mistake than they realised, as he'd clearly run straight back to the city-states to inform them of what had happened, and the city-states had chosen to respond with an attack of their own. With Magnala already down as a result for beating at the hands of Guthor and Jayla, and Blackthorn still heavily damaged from her run-in with Magnala, Blackthorn figured that once again she'd be more help using her magic to summon animals, even if it took her out of the fight entirely. Thankfully, the animals she called intercepted one group of the attackers and completely obliterated them, meaning that only a small handful initially got through to the town's defences. After defeating the first group, the animals then rounded on the second larger group as it approached. This second group was unfortunately much better armed and armoured than the first, and finished off the remaining animals. But the animals had done a wonderful job of breaking the raid into more manageable groups for the defenders to handle. Despite their heavy armour, the defences did a good job of slowing the attackers' approach, allowing the archers to fill them with more arrows before they got close, meaning that the raid was handled with little damage to the defenders. One of the attacking dwarves even survived the attack, so the collective were quick to scoop them up and incarcerate them alongside their companion Etis, ready to be convinced to join the collective. Whether he'd been convinced or just mentally broken down after realising his people had failed to liberate him, Etis soon gave in and agreed to join the collective in exchange for his freedom. Their new prisoner wasn't so agreeable, however, and soon broke down the door to their cell to try and escape. Unfortunately for them, they were immediately faced with Oywoon and Magnala, who wasted no time in beating the prisoner until they couldn't walk. Seeing their numbers expand so much with these new Dwarven additions got Guthor excited about the further expansion of the collective. So he rallied a bunch of the group, mounting most of them on the numerous horses they still had left, and set out for a small farm nearby, which was run by some elves on behalf of the forest cities to the south. Whilst Magnala and their new friend Etis stayed back on foot, the archers rode in on their horses, getting close enough to the local elves to start taking shots. Once the locals then began to get close, they pulled back, allowing Magnala and Etis to move forward and engage the locals in melee combat. They made swift work of the first group, unfortunately killing all of them. Their primary goal here was to take some of the elves alive, so that they could be convinced to join the collective. Magnala had even brought a large hammer with her instead of her sword, in the hopes that it might prove ever so slightly less lethal. Thankfully, a second, larger group appeared to provide support to the farm. The collective followed the same tactic again, using the horse-mounted archers to lure the elves towards the melee fighters, whilst peppering them with arrows. The local elves never stood a chance. A few of them sadly managed to flee, but in the end, they did have one that was left alive, which still made the journey worthwhile. They patched this prisoner up before throwing them in the back of one of the horses and beginning the march back to Ysera's perch. Back at the perch, their current prisoner tried once more to break their way out, only to find themselves confronted again by Oywoon, who'd stayed behind, and an old comrade, Coalpillar, both of whom, once again, swiftly beat the prisoner into submission. The next morning, the rest of the group returned to the peninsula, incarcerating their new prisoner in the cells and celebrating a successful excursion. Good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, whichever it is, wherever you are. Tuna here just to say thank you once again for watching. Things are getting pretty tough for the collective now, but progress is being made. It feels like they might soon be ready to make their move. But you'll just have to check in later to see how that turns out. Until then, I hope life treats you well, and I shall see you again shortly.